Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. We do so by painting an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those individuals are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality and the reintegration process. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please, welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 93 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. Hey, I want to kick this program off by thanking Veronica Ballard Cunningham, Executive Director of American Probation and Parole Association, for hosting an awesome conference this past week down in Atlanta. Veronica and her entire team did a great job of hosting both the on-site conference and the virtual offerings which they put on, which I encourage you all to check out if you are APPA members. Also, big shout out to Brian Lovins. Brian and I presented at APPA on the topic of how we go about building capacity in our agencies to augment our existing risk, need, responsivity approaches with the emerging desistance approaches. Thanks, Brian, for asking me to come down and lay the foundation for what we hope is an ongoing conversation as to this very important topic. If you are not a member of American Probation and Parole Association, they are a great resource for all of you looking to grow as professionals. I would encourage you all to join, become members. It's a great resource, and they will be back their next conference in just 6 months in the lovely city of Chicago, Illinois. So please check out that great resource. Today, I'm happy to be bringing you all another Greatest Hits episode. Recall, loyal listeners, I did this lastly on New Year's Eve and discovered I could not squeeze in all the amazing content that we had from our 2021 guests. So I took my first bite at the apple then. I'm going to take another bite today. We are going to pick this up where we left off, right around episode 66, when I spoke with the incredible Kardell Sims. Kardell was on the program last year, talking all about his lived experiences in the criminal justice system. He spoke of his pathway into a criminal trajectory and his inspiring story, highlighting the milestones and breakthroughs he experienced on his pathway out of criminality. Kardell Sims is author of the book Inmate to Inspiration: How I Freed Myself from Self-Destruction. Mr. Kardell Sims is also the host of the Reentry Journey podcast, so please check that out. Here is a taste of my interview with Mr. Kardell Sims from 2021. Please enjoy.
When I walked into the federal courtroom, because when the feds picked us up, they took us to the federal courthouse in the holding cell. Then they walked us in the federal courtroom and they handed us this paper. And on this paper, it was an indictment paper. They had your charges and your name and everybody's name and nicknames and everything. And so I'm looking at this paper and I'm not really focused on the charges and the time. I'm not really focusing in on that conspiracy intent of life. I'm focusing in on the fact that it says Kardell Sims versus the United States of America. And I'm like, man, it's not versus the state of Missouri or the county that I lived in or nothing like that. This is the United States of America. Like I really made it to the top in a sense, because in the streets, in the drug game, like if you make it to the feds, you a big dog. You made it to the top. While I was looking at that, I kept asking myself, like, man, why do you keep finding yourself in these situations? Why do you keep finding yourself here? And I realized right then that I was the first victim of my own actions. Not the only victim, but the first victim. And from that point on, I just started doing everything that I can to prepare myself for whenever. I didn't know when I was getting out, but start preparing myself to never come back to prison and be a different person when I got out of prison.
You are going to want to check out episode 66 to learn more about the steps Kardell Sims took to indeed prepare himself for reintegration. Awesome having Kardell on the show. Okay, next we are getting out our listener passports and jetting over the Atlantic to the Emerald Isle of Ireland. Joining us all the way from Dublin is Daryl Mahone. I am so glad to have Daryl in my life. I met Daryl. He agreed to be on the show. We've kept in contact since then. His passion and enthusiasm cannot be contained. If you are unfamiliar with the concept of servant leadership, this is a must listen for you and or your agency, whether you are private sector, public sector, a nonprofit, even an NGO. Leadership is key to successful implementation. So again, if you are unfamiliar with the concept of servant leadership, episode 66 with Daryl Mahone is a must listen. Here is a taste of my conversation with Daryl. Sit back and enjoy and soak up some of Daryl's enthusiasm and subject matter expertise.
And that really set me off on a real deep interest into servant leadership. And I was just so surprised at the impact of it, the outcomes that are associated with it. When you look at it and it's measured up, and this is empirically, it's measured up to other leadership approaches, it just comes out on top all the time. You guys over there are probably more familiar with it. Places like Southwest Airlines have a servant-led organisation and governance, and many of the Fortune 500 companies. These guys aren't doing this for nothing. They're not doing this to lose money. So it's for me, it's an absolute no-brainer. You can treat people well. You can have an excellent organisational culture. And you can make a shitload of money if that's your thing, But for non-profit organisations, it just makes so much sense to actually have that. They're not out there to make money, so. And even if they were, you could still do this with servant leadership. So it's just a no-brainer for me. I think what I've come to understand is that certain personality types may gravitate more towards leadership positions, and often this personality type is far from the servant leader. So there's a whole host of stuff that can go on there and in implementation and looking at that. So that's where my interest started and why my interest started. Subsequently, I went on to publish. I made a couple of publications based off that master's thesis. And then I suppose, put some training together based on that. So it's based on my publications. And then the servant leader supervision, I suppose, came into it. I have two scales / measures that I use for the supervision process and the general servant leadership approach, and it just makes sense. I guess if you're, the most recent publication on that was using servant leadership to mitigate against burnout and secondary trauma in health and social care organisations. So you'll find that on my LinkedIn profile as well if anyone's interested, and they can get access to it. Or on ResearchGate, actually, the whole paper's there. You don't have to go through a journal, so you can have access to that. And it's really something that's really pertinent at the moment, given, well, in general, but I suppose with the whole issue around COVID and the pandemic, there's people, practitioners across health and social care organisations are really feeling it. So I suppose I try to contribute in some way in offering up something that may be helpful. That said, it really needs to be part of a wider organisational cultural change. You're not just going to learn it, go on a 2-day training course and go back to the organisation and try and do this in a really negative culture that is power dominant. And that's really the probably key issue with servant leadership. It's about using power responsibly. So it's an ethical and moral approach that really puts people first. And this is why so many people can find it difficult to get their head around.
So many people, indeed, David, find it hard to get their head around that concept of servant leadership. If you are intrigued, again, go back and check out episode 67 with the amazing Daryl Mahone. He talks about servant leadership and so much more. Daryl really is a great asset over there in Ireland. We hope to have him back on the show very soon. Okay, next up, I want to share with you a taste of my interview last year with David Garlock. David is a successful returning citizen, reentry professional, and criminal justice reform advocate. David is actually a client of the Equal Justice Initiative founded by the incredible Bryan Stevenson. David was released on parole in 2013 after serving more than 13 years in prison. Listen to his full episode to learn of his amazing journey and his accomplishments assisting others on their journeys. David is currently a board member of the Lancaster County Reentry Management Organization and member of the Pennsylvania Reentry Council. Here is a flavor of my interview with David Garlock.
Yeah, so straight ahead, we're a C3 organization that has come out of the Abolitionist Law Center here in Pennsylvania. And the work that we're doing is to create parole eligibility for people with life without parole and to create a geriatric medical parole. So in the U.S., there's 55,000 people that have life without parole. In Pennsylvania, there's 5,447 people. So 1 out of 10 people that have life without parole are in Pennsylvania. And what's sad is the first state is Pennsylvania, is Florida, and Florida has twice the population, the prison population, than Pennsylvania does. So, I mean, those disparities are crazy. Then we think about people that this group of geriatric individuals who are over 55. We have 10,600 people in that age range in Pennsylvania's prison. And it is so sad that we have so many people this age. And it's not because there's huge influx of crime waves of people that are 55 and older. It's because of lengthy sentences. It's because of life without parole. It's because of virtual life sentences. So virtual life sentences are sentences of typically 25 years or more. What we're working on is we're working on these two bills because we know that these individuals age out of crime. And so when you think about different theories within the criminal justice mind frame, there's this theory called life course theory. And in it, they have a thing called early onset offending. And so what this talks about is people who have committed an offense at a young age, and there's something that happens in their life that changes it, and it changes their trajectory. And so a lot of times it could be prison, but inside prison, it could be they meet somebody and get married, or there's a loss of a loved one that really makes them to challenge their thinking and why they committed offenses and make them think that, okay, I need to change my ways. I don't want to go commit offenses again. And the recidivism rates for those who have committed violent offenses, or what society considers violent offenses, is so low. I mean, people who've committed murder, people who've committed sexual offenses have the lowest recidivism rates out there. But society and the media wants to portray this population as as monsters, as boogeymen. I'm here to say that this population is not that. Yes, there might have been a violent offense, but we're not violent offenders.
In that episode, David speaks of his experiences with Bryan Stevenson and his Equal Justice Initiative. I had the honor of hearing Bryan Stevenson speak recently in Atlanta at the American Probation and Parole Association event. Bryan was a keynote speaker for our opening plenary, and holy cow, I cannot say enough about the amazing work that Bryan Stevenson is doing. Check out his Equal Justice Initiative. And again, David is one of his former clients. Next up, I want to highlight a little bit of my interview with Brad Bogue of Jsat. I have had the pleasure of knowing Brad on and off in a number of iterations for 10 plus years. Brad has taught me, and I know so many of you, a lot of great things around evidence-based practices, and in particular, things related to the risk, need, responsivity framework, but so much more. Brad is uniquely qualified to give a well-informed and timely critique to the needs principle, which we did in episode 70, from a re-examination of the Big Four to the very real issue of differential diagnosis. This could be a game changer, folks. Brad packs a college seminar's worth of insights into this episode. Always have a great time whenever I get to talk to Brad. This interview was no exception. Check it out, and I encourage you to listen to his entire interview back in episode 70.
The R&R model was developed prior to the publication of Godfredson and Hershey's book. Prior to that kind of very conclusive evidence and knowledge that low self-control is a major, you might say, criminogenic need. And it's not found in the model that was formulated by Bonta and Andrews. So what you see there is, it's not obvious. I think it is there latently, and I've talked to Dr. Bonta and Dr. Andrews before he passed away about this, and they acknowledged it was probably unfortunate timing that they didn't have insight into that at that time, that knowledge base that emerged in 1990. So what they have is a pretty good proxy, I think, for low self-control is criminal history. Most people look at criminal history as, well, that's static and you can't change that, right? Well, that's pretty true. I mean, you could increase the amount of criminal history. You could increase the amount of versatility in the history, but you can't really diminish what's happened already. What the developmental psychologists and theorists around low self-control say is that it manifests, one of its most common manifestations is unruly behavior, and AKA criminal behavior. And that you can, another way that it manifests is accident proneness. Those are two very gross manifestations of low self-control. So you can look at the versatility of someone's criminal history, or you can look at the extensiveness of it to determine if there's, that's a big, juicy clue whether they have issues with low self-control or poor self-regulation. Those terms, as far as I can tell, are pretty synonymous. And what are we talking about when we're talking about low self-control? Or we're talking about something that's developmental and it's exquisite. It's orchestral in its development. It's over time. And we talk about people learning self-control and self-regulation skills in a sequence over time. And much of that development is occurring during adolescence. early adolescence, mid-adolescence, and late adolescence and into the mid-20s, which happens to coincide with the high-risk period for involvement in criminal behavior. So most of us who are involved in criminal behavior of some type or another, whether it was shoplifting or soaping windows or doing something, or, you know, a little bit more. I mean, it's a long continuum, but the research, the longitudinal research, you know, with representative samples of the population show that most of us were involved in it, and most of us, 80% or so, desisted by the time we hit mid-20s. So that J curve they talk about happens right in there at the same time that all this wonderful development's taking place. However, sometimes some of us miss some of the buses, the developmental buses, and maybe we're just preoccupied with, hormones and sexual politics, or we're getting involved in drugs at pre-algebra, and we just kind of check out, and we aren't really mindful of the shop anymore. And by the time algebra rolls around next year, we're hosed. We've missed that developmental bus, if you will, for finer abstract thinking, which is what algebra symbolizes.
I always have a great time talking to Brad because I always learn so much from him. I really had a hard time finding a best of clip within Brad's entire interview because it was just chock full of good, insightful stuff for an evidence-based practices champion such as myself and such as I suspect many of you are. So go back and listen to that entire episode to get a lot more insights from the very insightful Bradford Bogue. Next up, I want to share a little bit of my conversation last year with Dr. Craig Waleed. Dr. Waleed shares his incredible journey from the New York penal system to the world of academia and publishing. Dr. Waleed is passionate about disrupting the community to prison pipeline and reducing post-incarceration recidivism. You can hear all about his experiences from Sing Sing Prison in New York to his current role as a mentor, coach, and a participant of panel discussions, workshops, podcast guest, and so much more. I really had a fun time talking to Craig. Here is a flavor of that interview from last year.
I was introduced to a college program, and they were offering an associate's degree program, and it was through the consortium of the Niagara Frontier, which was a gathering of three colleges: Damon College, Canisius College, and Niagara University up in Western New York. And so I joined this program, and eventually I became a tutor in the program, but also I became a disciple of the program, not just a student, but a disciple, and I was very disciplined. I began to really pour my all into my studies. And as I did that, I began to realize how my thinking about my own potential and my own future began to change. This allowed me to see greater possibilities for myself. And so once I began to imagine and dream and envision greater possibilities for myself, the more I wanted to pursue advanced education. And so eventually, I completed my associate's degree in 1997, just before I got out, and so here I was with an associate's degree coming out of prison. So I had the stigma of being a formerly incarcerated person, but I also had this small degree, but to me it was very significant, coming out of prison. And it said to me that I can do even greater things, and I can change my life. And part of that, even before I came out of prison, part of that thinking was not only will I be able to change my life, but I'll also be able to set examples for other men and other women who have been incarcerated so that they can see, hey, this guy, Craig Waleed, changed his life through the pursuit of higher education. And so, therefore, they may also begin to believe that they too can change their lives, through the pursuit of higher education.
Desistance is contagious. How many times have we heard that before? Desistance is contagious. Thank you, Dr. Craig Waleed, for spreading that contagion and for also highlighting one of the many pathways out of criminality into desistance, which, as you just showcased there and in the full episode, education, among other pathways. And you also got into a little bit of that identity transformation in your episode. I encourage you all to go back and check out the full interview. Okay, up next, I had a really fun time interviewing Dr. Anna Sergi, a senior lecturer from the University of Essex. As I talked about on this particular episode, many of us, including myself, learned most of what we know as to the mafia and organized crime from sources such as the Godfather movies or the Sopranos television show. Well, I really like debunking myths on this program, particularly myths that are propagated by the media, which is why I had a really fun time with this interview, learning all sorts of fun things, such as how close are the five families of New York still linked with the Italian mafia, and how has the secrecy around organized crime factored into our understanding of this topic. These and so many other intriguing things I spoke about with Anna. Here is just a taste of that interview back from 2021.
I'm talking about the US specifically, right? So you are in a situation where you are at least at the third, fourth generation of Italian migrants. So Italian-American mafia, which was Italian-American at the very beginning, is now pretty much fully American. And that means that if you keep calling it Italian, you give it a flavor and an overlapping with the ones that are in Italy at the moment, which is most of the time unjustified. So that I think is one of the issues. So why do we keep calling the five families Italian mafia? It's beyond me. I just genuinely don't understand it. Yes, they do have the SAR names, which is more of a brand than anything else, because we know that the recruitment of these families is very much not necessarily sticking to the Italian heritage anymore. So that to me is phenomenally. So I started wondering about that, and I actually found this trend in Australia, in Canada, where there is something called Italian organized crime, IOC, which is the way police try to create names for things, which again creates a problem because it goes around. This Italianness includes either a nationality assumption, which is not the case, because as I said, many of these individuals eventually might have some Italian origin, but most of the time are descent. Or it's not quite clear what's the added value of saying Italian. So it's a very confused thing for an academic, because I want to ask these questions, and I always ask these questions to all the police officers and everyone I talk to. And you can see that when they start thinking about it, they see the problem. It's just that Italian organized crime means traditional organized crime. It means hierarchical organized crime. It means family-based organized. It means so many things that no one ever bothers anymore to actually challenge that. So I think that's probably one of the main issues. And I don't know if you want others, but from this, there are many others, which include cross-border dimensions. Not all Italian mafia groups, Italian-American mafia groups have international dimensions. We have seen in the recent years, couple of years actually, some activities to try and reconnect some parts of the so-called Gambino family with their connections in Sicily. But that's one thing. The majority of the activities remain local. And actually, the more I looked at it, the less fancy they seem. The Italian mafia is not that fancy at all, especially abroad. They are local, they're struggling, they are scraping to trying to find their place in the underworld. So it's a lot less glamorous. But I think the nostalgia of certain things, of the imagined reality of certain things, is probably still very powerful.
Loyal listeners of this show know that we love promoting the themes of desistance from crime on the program, which is why I was absolutely thrilled to bring you the insights of one of the world's leading thinkers on this topic, referring to, of course, Dr. Fergus McNeil, University of Glasgow. Dr. McNeil has been behind some incredibly innovative initiatives in his career, from the groundbreaking documentary, The Road from Crime, to his Distant Voices project. Dr. McNeil is never satisfied with the status quo as to our approaches around crime and reintegration. Listen to this episode in full or get a taste coming up next as we get a glimpse into the future of what our correctional and rehabilitative efforts may look like moving deeper into the 21st century. Here is a taste of my interview with Dr. Fergus McNeil.
Yeah, so I knew that this invisibility was a problem, and that the lack of representations of supervision in popular culture meant that it was almost literally unimaginable to potential readers. But to answer your question more directly, just before I started writing the book, I was speaking to my wife about it, and she's an elementary school teacher. We call them primary schools over here. And she's an avid reader of books, but almost always fiction books. So I said to her, are you going to read this book that I'm writing? She doesn't usually read criminology. And she said, I don't know, are you going to make it interesting? And I said, well, what would make it interesting? And she said, I like stories and I like characters. And I thought about it for a minute. And actually I went off on a train journey to the British Criminology Conference in Cardiff, and I thought I would just use the train journey to have to experiment with fictionalising some of the book's content. So I wrote the first episode of the story on that train journey and presented it to her when I got home, and she liked it. She said basically it intrigued her. You know, it made her want to know what was going to happen next to the characters involved, not just Joe, but also the supervisor, Pauline. And basically that as a result of that, every chapter of the book opens with another episode of the short story. And they're all constructed very carefully, I should say, because I am a social scientist. The stories are as evidence-based as the rest of the book. So, okay, I don't put references in the stories because I don't want the reader to be derailed by having to check the citations. But the citations are in the chapter that follows. The evidence base for why the story is as it is in the book. It's just I'm trying to present that research in a way which is more vivid, by situating it in the unfolding life of Joe and the life of Pauline as his supervisor. And the feedback seems to be, by and large, that device works very well to engage the reader and to bring the issues to life, which is exactly the intention.
Lest you are curious, which you should be, Dr. McNeil was referencing his amazing book, Pervasive Punishment, Making Sense of Mass Supervision. He essentially talks about how we had our eyes on the prize as far as reducing incarceration, but an unintended consequence was ballooning supervision caseloads, which is what this fantastic book is all about. Friend of the program, Dr. Shad Maruna, in his critique of the book, writes, "Remarkable and groundbreaking. This singular work will challenge your understanding of punishment, as well as your views about the limitations of academic work." I encourage you all to go out and purchase a copy of Pervasive Punishment by Dr. Fergus McNeil. Okay, next up, I want to interview an episode I did last year in which I interviewed Brian Pierce, talk about a story of growth and resilience. Brian shares his journey from a small town in Minnesota to correctional facilities in his home state to Georgia as well. His experiences in those jails and prisons to milestones of law school graduation and so much more are all highlighted in this episode. Brian's pathways into and out of crime are not typical, but exemplify that the process is rarely linear. Here's a flavor of my interview from 2021, back during episode 77 with Brian Pierce.
An award for people who are not attorneys but contribute to the bar or assist people in the legal field. And I really liked it, to be honest with you. I know, obviously, I would prefer to get an award as an attorney. In Minnesota, I got a Rising Star Award, but I really did appreciate this because it reminded me that I actually can still do something useful and make a difference and help people, because it's really hard to keep believing that. I'll tell you, one big thing now, I don't want to go off on a long tangent, but one big thing now is the ban the box, where they're saying, don't ask about felons. And, I've wanted to get involved with some of these movements, but I'm afraid that some people might not like my position because, I'm not even sure that helps much, because I've had really bad experiences with that, to be honest with you. I wanted to teach the LSAT. I had a very high LSAT score. In fact, that's how I got into Mensa. My LSAT score was so high, I qualified for Mensa. So I thought, well, I'll teach the LSAT. This is just a couple of years ago now. I've been working at a law firm for years. And so the first thing I said to them was, just so you know, I've got a serious felony record before I waste your time and mine. Oh, no, that's not a problem. The interview took 6 months, literally. It was a series of interviews. I had to teach 3 mock classes online. I had to prepare them, teach them all this stuff. At every step of the way, I said, just so we're clear, I don't want to waste your time and mine. I've got this record. Oh, it's not a problem. It's not a problem. I went through all this, and then they did the background check, because they're not prevented from doing it. They just don't ask it on the application. So then right away, they're like, no, can't do it.
One of the things we know from the desistance literature is that desisted individuals have this sense of wanting to give back, if you will. We heard a little bit of that there in Brian Pierce's story. If you listen to Dr. Craig Waleed, when he talked about how he found his passion in tutoring individuals and educating individuals, we see this theme throughout, which is one of the things I love about doing this program. Okay, next, I want to highlight a great interview I did last year with Dr. Vincent Figliomeni, joining us from his home in Calabria, Italy. We learned all about Dr. Figliomeni's unique pedigree, which led him from the University of Iowa to the United States military to his home country of Italy. Vincent shares some of his work with us, which has covered topics as varied as piracy off the coast of Africa to his passion of Italian organized crime. Aspiring criminologists can learn so much from Vincent, as he has consistently leveraged his prior educational experiences to whatever his current passion project may be. Here is a flavor of episode 78, my interview with Dr. Vincent Figliomeni.
How do I get to routine activities? Well, that's my criminology background. So when I was doing this job, I started to see a pattern. I started to see that the things that we were doing and the things that the international community was doing, and the things that policies that were being created. You know, if you recall, Somalia was the big problem in East Africa. East Africa, the focal point was Somalia. They didn't have a government, but they had an interim government. And so what was happening was, while I was there, just coincidentally, while I was there, that interim government began to create activities and began to do things with their authority they were given by the international community in concert with the international community, the Maritime Bureau, and some of the other international partners, the NATO presence there with NATO ships. The EU had ships down in East Africa. We're all trying to look at how can you deal with piracy in a more effective way. And in fact, with all those things together, I saw that a routine activities approach was probably the best. Now, let me just give you a brief synthesis on the routine activities approach. You're looking at motivated offenders, you're looking at suitable targets, and you're looking at capable guardians that are absent. Well, if you correct all that, if you try to deal with the motivated offenders and deter them, if you try to make the suitable targets harder, in other words, make them more less penetrable, you're more resistant, and you get those capable guardians out there doing what they need to do to apprehend offenders, well, then you have yourself a situation where maybe you got a chance at deterring the Somali, mostly Somali pirates that were operating in East Africa at the time. And so it's much more complicated than that. It's in the book. I explain it in excruciating detail, but in a nutshell, that's what it is. I mean, and it's actually, here's the other thing. It's a good news story that in law enforcement and global security, we don't have many of those. We don't have many times where we can say we all put our heads together, we focused on the problem, we applied solutions, and the outcome was exactly what we wanted, a reduction in maritime piracy in East Africa. Now, on the flip side, the problem, as I predicted in that book, the problem is West Africa. And that's what the second version of my book will be once I get enough time and opportunity to focus on the current situation in West Africa, which is as bad as what was in East Africa, some 8-9 years ago. So that's it in a nutshell, Joe. I hope that helps.
Let's keep it international. My next guest joined us all the way from Australia, Perth, Australia, to be precise. Dr. Lukas Carey is host of his own podcast, Talking Time with Lukas and Alicia. Dr. Carey is a trainer, educator, teacher, and academic who believes that a person's mistakes do not necessarily represent who they are. Lukas wants to use his own lived experiences to provide a voice for those people. He did a great job of highlighting his passion back on episode 80. Here is a flavor of that interview. Dr. Lukas Carey from Perth, Australia. So I think the for me now, I mean, the time when you're sitting inside a box or sitting inside a cage for a period of time gives you a great opportunity to actually review and go back over your world from point one to point wherever it was. And I look back now, and I think that strain theory played a really strong point in my offending. We were in a position. We just had a new child, went from 2 wages to 1 wage. We were living out of our means, these sort of things. And to get, to get a little envelope from someone after I'd done some work, not expecting it, was like, hey, this is okay. This can help here. And it obviously did at the time. But what also obviously the ability to look at this is once I was sitting inside, saw it and assessed it and looked at it, I was like, you know what, I've got to make something big of this. We're going to make something better of this. And when I went home, was literally sitting on the couch applying for jobs. And as you know, and as your listeners know, is that when you got a criminal record, those job opportunities shrink really quickly. And I was lucky enough to have a supportive partner, little kids waiting for me. And
it was a challenge, Joe, but to say I had a light bulb moment would be an understatement. I was sitting on the couch applying for a job and a light bulb moment hit me. All right, you need to look up and find online what can be done with someone with a criminal record. And I found a group in the US called Convict Criminology and spoke to Stephen Richards, contacted Stephen Richards, and that was the start of the journey. And the start of the journey he had suggested was, okay, you've got a doctorate in education, you've got some lived experience, but let's actually pair this up. Let's get you into a criminology master's degree. Let's get you understanding that. Let's link the two bits together. And then that happened, and from there we've got to the point now, so much so that not only do we work and engage with the convict criminology guys too, but I've actually designed and I'm in the process of releasing a lived experience Dorduk Kulini, which is the Indigenous Australian words for it, criminology, which actually takes the work of convict criminology, puts it into an Australian aspect, and is assisting others in sharing their stories to attempt to change policy and procedure.
And there you have it again. Once again, this theme of desisted individuals having a desire to give back as part of their process. All right. Next up, I want to highlight a little bit of my interview last year with Brian Kane, president and founder of Social Profit Corrections. What did Brian and I talk about? All sorts of intriguing things, such as static security versus dynamic security. Brian's going to share with us his somewhat unique vision of prison philosophy, at least here in America. With over 28 years of correctional experience, he knows what does not work. Here, what he sees as an alternative to business as usual, the aforementioned dynamic security. Now, dynamic security has been operationalized in Norway, and Brian Kane believes it is the path we should choose here in the United States. His nonprofit agency, Social Profit Corrections, is an exciting alternative to explore. Here is a flavor of my insight with Brian Kane.
When you look in corrections, rarely do you come up with original ideas. You just look at ideas that have worked or do work, within the community. And a dynamic security is a European concept, a Scandinavian concept. If you look at the Norway model and you look at their successes, they took their recidivism from 91%, I believe, down to 20%. As compared to our current 83%, which is similar to their past. So you have to ask the question, well, how did you do that? I mean, clearly their system, at one point was dysfunctional because 91%, that's even worse than ours. They brought humanity to corrections, and really that's what dynamic security is. It's the people-based, the human-based, the professional relationships. And one of the root cause, I believe, in our country is by policy, by practice, by culture. We have prohibited staff from having relationships, and I know that's a dangerous word in American corrections, but relationships with the incarcerated people. I'm not talking about personal relationships. Clearly, that's a bad idea and wrong. But I'm talking about professional relationships where we allow the staff. We allow the professionals to have purpose. They're not just there with their arms crossed and call codes when things go bad, crisis management to do their accounts. They're there to help human beings. It's kind of more of a, I like to relate it to a coaching role. Correctional officers should be coaches where they encourage. I don't expect them to teach, addictions treatment or, deal with mental health crisis because they're not trained for that. They're not certified for that, but they can have a conversation. Good morning. Jeremy, how are you doing today? Did you have a conversation with your daughter last night? That we spoke about. Oh yeah. How'd it go? I mean, just a professional conversation. Yes, I'm a parent. I can relate. You need to mend that bridge that you burnt with your family. Having these kinds of conversations, or do you have an education? No. Are you enrolled in the GED program? Yes. Well, I've been on the waiting list for 2 years. Okay, well, let me make a call, and see if I can find out what's going on so I can help you get into school. Or no, and one of the challenges with incarcerated people is they haven't had many successes in life, so that, and many times they don't have a lot of confidence, and encouraging them, coaching them, to engage in a GED, just as an example, because we know if you have a basic education, your chance of coming back in the system is a lot less. So encouraging them to go to school, and then maybe even helping them. But our country is so afraid of staff being compromised, and they bring in contraband. Compromise, you bring in drugs. Compromise, you bring in cell phones. Compromise, you fall in love. Which is one of the more dangerous words in corrections. And so the policies and the culture over our 245 years has restricted staff from engaging in professional relationships. Well, we're human. We're wired to get along, to like people. We're social beings, and so in corrections, by policy, by process, by culture, you're told, don't be human. Don't interact. Stay your distance, do your security responsibilities, but don't, engage with the population because you will or could become compromised. But my frustration when you look at the whys is, well, clearly that doesn't work, because our prisons are full of cell phones, they're full of drugs, they're full of bad relationships, so this whole requiring people to disengage from the population is part of our root cause, which is part of our recidivism, which is part of the 16 years lifespan, of less. It's part of our dysfunction. I mean, that has to change.
Brian Kane of Social Profit Corrections. Some really insightful ideas about how we need to adjust corrections here in America moving forward. Okay, kids, let's go back to back Brian's. Next, I want to feature a little bit of my interview with Dr. Brian Lovins. Dr. Lovins is president of the American Probation and Parole Association. We had a fun time talking about his earlier work with the University of Cincinnati's Corrections Institute. Many of you are aware of the great work that UCCI does. Brian also shared his previous work experiences with Harris County Community Supervision and Corrections, where he did some groundbreaking work as well. Dr. Lovins has a passion for his work, and it really comes through in this interview. I also mentioned that I was recently in Atlanta for APPA. I spoke alongside Brian. We did a little roundtable workshop on how we can merge the ideas around R&R with those of the emerging desistance principles and philosophy. So I will give you some information on how to check that out if you were not able to attend APPA in Atlanta. But in the meantime, please enjoy a flavor of my interview with Brian Lovins.
The way that probation and parole have been operationalized over the course of especially the last 30 years with the get tough on crime kind of movement is that when you boil it down, conditions are set, or probation rules or parole rules, however you want to look at them, they're set. The officer from day one starts looking for failure of them, recording it, and ultimately reporting it out. And it's rinse, repeat. And it's continuing to bring them back. And what our goal is in that, I believe, is to do exactly what a referee does on a field, which is to get compliance. We're going to keep monitoring you and look at all these interventions, the HOPE model, smart punishment. All these interventions are like, can we punish people smarter? Can we use deterrence models? Can we figure out how the right level of punishment, the right timing of it, and the right dosage of it? And it's like, all of those things are problematic when we start to think about the fact that we know that punishment stops behavior, but it doesn't replace it with something new. So and I know we'll get a little bit deeper in the analogy of the sports stuff, but my analogy often is, right, like if I have a left tackle in football who keeps holding the person in front of them because they can't stop, they don't have the talent to stop the person from rushing the quarterback, and my job is to protect the quarterback, and so if I have to, I'm going to hold and try to get away with it. If I keep getting the whistle blown, if I'm a coach, my job would be to teach him a technique that can get him through the game to be successful. If I'm a referee, my job isn't to say, hey, look, you keep holding the guy. Let me show you a move so that you don't have to hold him anymore, or call a different play in a different direction so that the left tackle doesn't ruin the game. A referee just blows the whistle and they'll just keep calling a hold as long as they hold them. And so that was really where it was born out of, was this idea that staff didn't want to reinforce people.
Brian was referencing a great article that he co-authored, essentially talking about how the role of the probation officer is evolving from that of referee to that of coach. And he did a great job using sports analogies to make that point. You can track that article down, or you can simply listen to episode 81 of this podcast for the full interview with Dr. Brian Lovins. I've been excited to talk to several guests, most guests in fact, during the course of this podcast, but perhaps not so much as the thrill I got when I secured an interview with the one and only Dr. James Bonta. We discuss the backstory behind his seminal book, The Psychology of Criminal Conduct, and all things risk, need, responsivity. That episode is a must-listen for probation and parole officers, corrections officials, and anyone interested in effective interventions and approaches to utilize with justice-involved individuals. Here is a flavor of my interview with the esteemed Dr. James Bonta, episode 82.
In the 1980s, of course, there was a lot of people challenging the nothing works idea. And you had Paul Gendreau and Bob Ross writing reviews on this issue. And Don and myself and Bob Hogue also decided to take a review of the literature. And what we were trying to look for was patterns, or into what is it about the treatments that work particularly well and the ones that don't. Can we associate a pattern to these findings? And this is where in 1990 we published our paper outlining the risk-need responsivity model. There's a bit of a review at the beginning, and then we talk about the principles. And in that paper, we had actually 4 principles. There's the fourth one is the professional discretion principle. But everybody talks about the first 3. It's the one they're the ones that stand out, the ones that have the most research on it. And the risk principle basically says, look, it really matters who you treat, right? And who you treat are the medium and the higher risk offenders. The low risk offenders, they're low risk for a reason. They have certain strengths that they can overcome some difficulties largely on their own, maybe a little help here and there. But the high risk people, they have a lot of needs and they need more intervention. So the risk principle says, focus your services, your rehabilitation efforts on the medium to higher risk offenders. That's where you can make a difference. This is the pattern we saw in the treatment studies.
Dr. Bonta goes on to talk about the need principle and, of course, the responsivity principle. Not too often you get the information straight from the source, if you will. That was a really fun interview for me as a risk need responsivity champion. Okay, we're going to wrap things up today by highlighting a little bit of my interview with Dr. Alex Walker of the Alliance for Community and Justice Innovation, the good folks at ACJI out in Denver, Colorado. In this interview, Alex shares with us her journey from John Jay College of Criminal Justice to a stint with the Colorado Parole Board to co-founding ACJI with her incredible team of change leaders. If you or your agency are frustrated with implementation efforts, you got to check out this episode. More importantly, you need to investigate ACJI. Again, the Alliance for Community and Justice Innovation. Really good folks out there in Denver.
Well, how long do you have, Joe? That's a big question. But what I would say, if you had to boil it all down, most of us were raised up in this field, trained, studied, learned traditional change management strategies. And when we manage change, we are managing ourselves to stay within our status quo. And so a lot of the initiatives that we're trying to do, the shift that we're trying to make in this space, requires us to truly change the way that we've done business. And so I think change leadership is really what we wanted to bring to the field, was how can you lead change instead of trying to micromanage change in a way that keeps you just a little bit outside of your comfort zone. Change leadership really requires getting clear about your vision and doubling down on that vision and really aligning around all of that work. And it's a different skill set, and it makes people really uncomfortable. And as you know, there's lots of tools and things that you can learn about that you say, okay, this now makes more sense to me. But we're not trained to do that work. We're actually trained to do the management side of things. And these initiatives, as we kind of shift philosophies or try to integrate philosophies in the justice system around, are we correctional? Are we rehabilitative? Are we looking for deterrence or incapacitation or retribution? When we try to think about all the things that we're tasked to do in this space, implementation is really about significant change that has socially significant outcomes, and that requires us to step outside of our comfort zone and do things differently.
And that is a wrap, friends. If you were intrigued by any of those highlights from 2021, I encourage you to go back and check out those episodes in their entirety. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices or implementation or program design, or of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook page and our Instagram page at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We are also on Twitter at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow on Twitter. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Merchandise is available. If you're interested in a refrigerator magnet, pen, coffee mug, simply reach out to the show for details. And if you believe in what we're doing on the program, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us. Remember to follow the cut.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.